Last week, instead of singing songs, I ended up giving a devo. Why? Because I have been excited about the field of archaeology. It's, as I said last week, my new kick. And even since last week, I have continued to read into things and find out things that I didn't know before. In fact, Jill shared with me basically a documentary type of presentation on YouTube. Very compelling story. I wish I was prepared to present that tonight. I like to cross-reference with the Bible before I do that. But it was a very exciting story of people. They were trying to find Mount Sinai. They've got some ideas. No one really knows for sure. They also, in the process of trying to find Mount Sinai, came up with this idea of where the Hebrews may have traveled from Egypt, how they got there, where they might have actually crossed when God had, through Moses, parted the waters as the Egyptians chased after them. I've been looking up some other small artifacts that have been found that make mention of Israel, and there are a few of those. There are many different sites in the area, in Israel, in Jerusalem, so much that is out there that corroborates what the biblical text states. And one thing that I thought I might discuss with you tonight was just a little side journey I took. I was going to put it in one of the sermon series for the Evidence for the Bible because I have a section on archaeology that I'm starting to work on for that. However, it didn't make sermon as sermon material. It was more of a sidetrack of mine, but I still think it's worth talking about. We discussed how archaeology, archaeos and logos is the root form of archaeology, and archaeos meaning that which is ancient, and logos meaning the study or the story of. And so when you say archaeology, you're talking about the story of that which is ancient. And it's a relatively new science. We discussed that last week. And we also pointed out that we do not require archaeology to prove the Bible. However, the more that we find in archaeology, we are finding that it does corroborate the Bible. And many archaeologists are not of a religious nature. There are those out there who are. Many are not. Many are agnostic or even atheistic in dispensation. And so, disposition, not dispensation. And so, I want to give you a little bit of a story, and what this does, this story highlights how archaeology actually does happen, how it does unfold, and how sometimes the answers are not always clear. Archaeology is trying to put little fragmented pieces of a puzzle into some arrangement that makes sense, but you really don't have the whole puzzle, right? And so you tell as much of that ancient story as you can based on what you find in a scientific way. And where there are details, you can compare that to the biblical record. So the story I have for you tonight, briefly, there is this place called the Arava Desert. And I was reading Smithsonian Magazine from December of 2021, so it's a relatively recent article. And the Arava Desert is located south of the Dead Sea, toward the border of Jordan. And so if you're coming from Egypt up into that eastern Mediterranean area, you pass by Jordan. So it's in the southwest part of that, and it's just above Saudi Arabia, above that peninsula. And so the Arava Desert is in that area. And in 1934, there was an individual named Nelson Gluck. And if any of you have done any study in archaeology, he's a big name. He was an American rabbi and archaeologist, and he found this site known as the Timna copper mines, and he connected those with King Solomon. Most disputed him as being fanciful. However, Gluck was a real archaeologist, and he was also a pottery expert. And so if you get into the field of archaeology, you'll find out that pottery is one of the primary ways that you can identify and age a site. So people have been in the same places for a long time. They keep building over what each other have done. And so you can go through these layers called strata. And people also made pottery, and those are very unique through different cultures and time periods too. So you can use pottery, and he used pottery to date this Timna copper mine site to the time of Solomon. There was some slag, which for those of you who have done any mining know that that's a byproduct of smelting. So they found slag on site. They found some charcoal that helped fire the furnaces that they used there. And Gluck was quoted as saying that this was the largest and richest copper mining and smelting center in the entire Araba area. Well, a few decades later, 1969 comes along. There was another archaeologist and his crew. His name was Rothenberg. He found an Egyptian temple with some hieroglyphics on it. And so people became very skeptical of what Gluck had originally claimed with respect to mines dating to Solomon's time. And so they figured that these were Egyptian mines, which predated when the time that it was possibly mined during Solomon. So it would have been older. And so that school of thought from 1969 onward for a number of decades was the school of thought, well, Gluck was just being fanciful, a little bit out of his mind, that this is the real thing. But this is also how archaeology tends to work. You find one discovery, then you find another discovery, and you come up with different stories, and you have to test those hypotheses. Well, 2009 rolls along, and we have an individual named Erez Ben Yosef. And he teaches at Tel Aviv University. I don't know if he still does, but as of 2021 he did. Now, he's your typical agnostic, and he was completely indifferent to the historical accuracy of the Bible. So he didn't go in to this site with an agenda. In fact, he was a young archaeologist at the time, and it was just an easy area for a young archaeologist to go. It wasn't anywhere that anyone was terribly interested in, and it was not of any great significance, so it was a very safe area to put someone like him. Well, he found that charcoal, he found the slag. He started to date it as being much younger than ancient Egypt. And he also found some modern fabrics and textiles of various colors, including royal purple, very finely woven from wool. In fact, these textiles were woven to a quality that would have rivaled the Roman elite. And keep in mind that we're talking close to 800 BC, so Rome was probably just a village at that time. Just a small settlement. It had not grown to be an empire by then, not in the way that we think of it. And they found some camel bones, and then they started finding some advanced metallurgical tools. And then they found some different types of debris, organic material. They've got donkey droppings that they found that they figure are close to 3,000 years old. I'm not personally interested in donkey droppings, but they also found some other things of interesting note. And the donkey is interesting because, they're a work animal, right? So we know that there was some sort of operation going on. You can see the copper today. There's still interesting copper in that area. You can read geologic papers on that. And they found fish bones, pistachios, lentils, almonds, grapes. These are all items that would have had to been hauled in for quite a distance, because you're in the middle of this fairly barren desert. They also found artifacts in other places fairly far away that were forged from the metals of that mine, because you can look at the chemical properties and find this stuff. So they started developing a new hypothesis, a hypothesis that an advanced, wealthy civilization influenced these mines after the Egyptians, and that most of the mining actually took place circa Solomon's time. And they hypothesized that it's probably the kingdom of Edom, the Edomites. Now the curious thing is they didn't find structures. Most archaeologists are looking for towns, for cemeteries, for homes, for a palace, and you don't see any of that out there. But the operation, based on this evidence they found, was obviously advanced, very organized, and wealthy. There was a lot of wealth going through here. Well, that does fit a biblical description of Israel. They were a very nomadic people. They lived in tents a lot of the time. That's not to say they didn't have their central area, but the main body of the Israelite people were fairly nomadic and living in tents. Some agree with this hypothesis. Obviously, some are still skeptical. They think that David and Solomon's kingdom simply lack evidence. However, there are other archaeological sites that I won't discuss tonight that can support that. Thomas Levy, University of California, San Diego, is quoted as saying, "The work gives us a new set of hard data to interrogate ancient Israel from the near periphery of ancient Israel. That's exciting, and it's where people haven't been looking." And this is one of the exciting things about archaeology is you find new things, and you can form new hypotheses. And it seems in this particular case that the more we find, the more we're finding evidence that does corroborate the biblical account of Solomon's time. A few scriptures just to make mention of. 1 Kings chapter 10, we won't read these all, but in verses 14 through 29, you can see that passage speaks to Solomon's wealth and how he was the wealthiest of all kings in the earth. Sometimes these articles, the one I read, talked about King Solomon's mines. When you're reading things like the Smithsonian or other things, you need to be careful, because King Solomon's mines is not a term you find in the Bible. It's actually a title of a novel, and it basically an adventure-type novel that was written in the 19th century by H. Rider Haggard. And so that term, coined, King Solomon's mines, stuck ever since that book was written. So there's no King Solomon's mines per se, but we can see in 1 Kings chapter 10 how other nations brought wealth to Solomon. We see remember the Queen of Sheba brought gifts. And if you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 18, verse 8, "Likewise from Tibhath and from Shun, cities of Hadarezer, brought David very much brass, wherewith Solomon made the brazen sea and the pillars and the vessels of brass." So remember, David was preparing to have Solomon build the temple. And there was a lot of brass needed. Why am I talking about brass? Because brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. And Solomon did. If you look through Kings and Chronicles, you'll see that Solomon used brass in a lot of the temple furnishings. Again, in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 3, 22, verse 3, it reads, "And David prepared iron in abundance for the nails of the doors of the gates and for the joinings, and brass in abundance." Brass has a low melting point. It's easy to manipulate, and it resists corrosion. And, of course, it's very shiny, like gold. Not the same shine as gold, but it's very shiny and attractive. And it was used quite heavily. David got these from these other cities that I mentioned in 1 Chronicles 18:8. That's not from the Timna copper mines, though. Those sites were northeast of Damascus, which would have been north of this Araba area that our case study is in. So, but if this Timna copper mines site could still have been used. There could still have been trade and use for brass during King Solomon's reign and in that era. So again, when we cross-reference what we're finding, we also want to keep in mind the scriptures, which are also a very complete historical account. And we need to look at it objectively and not enter into it with bias. However, I think there's going to be a lot. I think maybe more could be discovered here. I'd be excited to see what else they might discover at this particular site. The evidence that we see is certainly not contradicting the Bible. And in further discussions, hopefully that we'll have, maybe in other studies or sermons, there are other archaeological discoveries that demonstrate much stronger corroboration with the Bible than even this example does. So I know that was a lot of information, but I wanted to give you an example of how archaeological discovery can work. It takes discoveries over a long period of time, and it does appear that the more we discover, despite the criticisms, we see growing evidence for the Bible from a scientific perspective. And I have yet to see it disprove the Bible. Well, if there's anybody here that needs to come forward with any prayer requests or needs, please feel free to step forward as we stand and sing.